I still remember discovering the legendary He-Man through Filmation's 1983 animated series, a far cry from the original version. Before he became the moral lesson-teaching, child-friendly superhero we all loved, He-Man sprang from a much darker, more mature fantasy world rooted in Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian style sword-and-sorcery and the atmospheric horror art of Frank Frazetta. When we first dove into those early mini-comics and original concept sketches, we were struck by the brutal post-apocalyptic Eternia, where death, violence, and morally ambiguous forces shaped everything. That's exactly what we're going to explore in this video, the buried dark inception of He-Man's lore. This is a fascinating topic and we're ready to dive right into it, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we do have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Origins in Darkness: The Barbarian Concept. Mark Taylor, the original designer of He-Man, conceived the character not as a noble prince, but as a primitive barbarian warrior named Torak. This early incarnation drew direct inspiration from the sword and sorcery genre that had captivated audiences through Conan's stories and Frank Frazetta's evocative paintings of muscular warriors in hostile environments. Taylor's concept featured a Viking-inspired barbarian who would later be immortalized in the Masters of the Universe Classics line as Victor, He-Man of the North. The original character design showed a savage warrior with weathered features, primitive clothing, and an arsenal of brutal weapons, including battle axes and shields. Unlike the clean-cut Prince Adam, who would eventually emerge, this early proto-He-Man was conceived as the greatest warrior of his primitive jungle tribe who left his people to defend the mysterious Castle Grayskull from the forces of evil. This barbarian had no secret identity, no royal connections, and certainly no moral qualms about using violence to achieve his goals. The world that surrounded this early He-Man was dramatically different from the colorful, technology-rich Eternia that Filmation would later present. Donald F. Glutt, who wrote the first 4 mini-comics, and Alfredo Alcala, who provided the atmospheric artwork, created what fans now call Savage Eternia, or Mini-Eternia, a post-apocalyptic wasteland born from catastrophe. In this original continuity, Eternia was described as a wild, untamed world that had been devastated by a mysterious Great War. References to this conflict appeared throughout the early comics, suggesting a cataclysmic event that had reduced advanced civilization to ruins and left behind only fragments of high technology scattered across a barbaric landscape. The planet had become a harsh environment where survival required strength, cunning, and the willingness to use violence against both monsters and men. This post-apocalyptic setting created a tone reminiscent of Mad Max or other dystopian futures where scattered tribes fought over resources and ancient artifacts held the key to power. High technology was described as an unusual artifact of the past, suggesting that the inhabitants of this world were essentially scavengers picking through the bones of a dead civilization. Castle Grayskull, a morally ambiguous fortress. Perhaps no element of the early He-Man universe better exemplified its dark origins than the original concept for Castle Grayskull itself. Mark Taylor's initial concept called the fortress the Dwell of Souls, or the Well of Souls, immediately establishing its connection to death and the supernatural. Unlike the benevolent source of heroic power it would become in the cartoon, the original Grayskull was morally neutral, a place of immense power that could be claimed by either good or evil forces. In the early mini-comics, Castle Grayskull was protected not by the kindly sorceress, but by ghostly demons that would attack anyone who dared to breach its inner sanctums. These supernatural guardians created an atmosphere of dread around the castle, suggesting that even approaching the fortress was a potentially deadly endeavor. The castle was described as containing great powers that would allow whoever controlled it to rule the planet, but these powers came with terrible risks. Mark Taylor's original story concept for Grayskull revealed even darker elements. According to Taylor, just being near the castle saps a being's life force, and extended habitation would cause dangerous personality changes in anyone who stayed too long. This soul-draining effect transformed the castle from a simple magical fortress into something approaching cosmic horror, a place where the very act of seeking power would corrupt and ultimately destroy those who pursued it. The sinister nature of early villains. The villains of the early He-Man universe possessed a depth and menace that far exceeded their later cartoon counterparts. Skeletor, the interdimensional conqueror. The most significant difference between the early and later versions of Skeletor lies in his origin and ultimate objectives. In the original mini-comics, Skeletor was not merely a local villain seeking to conquer Eternia, but an otherworldly entity whose very presence represented cosmic catastrophe. The early continuity established that Skeletor was originally an inhabitant of another dimension until he was transported to Eternia during the Great Wars when a hole opened in the dimensional wall. This origin story transformed him from a conventional antagonist into something approaching Lovecraftian horror, a being whose arrival had already brought devastation to an entire world. His motivations in the early stories were correspondingly more apocalyptic. Rather than simply seeking personal power over Eternia, Skeletor seeks to reopen the rift so that his entire race can invade and conquer Eternia. This made him the vanguard of an entire dimensional invasion, suggesting that his defeat of He-Man would result not just in political conquest, but in the complete annihilation or enslavement of all life on the planet. The stakes were genuinely cosmic rather than merely territorial. The psychological aspects of Skeletor were also a bit more disturbing. In the original minicomics, Skeletor becomes smitten with the goddess, a prototype for Teela, and seeks to make her his bride to help him in his conquest plans. This obsessive desire to possess and corrupt the divine feminine represented a deeply personal evil that went beyond simple megalomania. The character was driven not just by a lust for power, but by a desire to defile and dominate everything good and pure in the universe. Skeletor's relationship with his magical abilities also reflected a darker understanding of power. In the early stories, his sorcery was portrayed not as flashy energy blasts, but as corrupting influence that could fundamentally alter reality. His ability to open gateways between dimensions suggested mastery over cosmic forces that could unravel the very fabric of existence. This made him a threat not just to individual heroes, but to the stability of reality itself. The transformation of Beastman from his original Red Beast concept to his final design represents one of the most dramatic examples of how early villains were softened for mass consumption. Mark Taylor's original concept showed a savage bear creature that was brightly colored and fierce-looking. In Beastman's first mini-comic appearance, he's colored entirely red, with the exception of the yellow medallion on his chest, as well as his teeth, eyes, and claws, creating a visual style that emphasized his connection to blood and violence. More significantly, the early concept for Beastman positioned him not as Skeletor's henchman, but as the primary villain of the series before being relegated to henchman status. An early treatment described Beastman as another native of Eternia's jungles whose tribe, or pack, has seemingly always been at war with their natural enemies, the human tribe of He-Man. This established him as representing an entirely different threat than Skeletor, not an otherworldly conqueror, but a savage force of nature locked in primordial conflict with human civilization. The psychological profile given to early Beastman was genuinely disturbing. He was described as being driven by ferocity that makes him a natural leader and possessing the agility of a gorilla, but more unsettling was his characterization as someone who yearns to take one or more of He-Man's tribe's females as a bride, despite being totally evil and corrupt. This suggested a character driven by predatory instincts that combined violence with sexual menace in ways that would never appear in children's television. The early Beastman was also conceived with shape-shifting abilities that made him far more dangerous than his later incarnation. According to the treatment, when he dons his various costumes, he takes on the powers of other animals. The speed of a gazelle, the charging force of a rhino. This versatility made him a genuine match for He-Man's strength, capable of adapting his abilities to counter whatever advantages the hero might possess. The early conception of Merman drew directly from horror comic traditions in ways that made him far more menacing than his later portrayal as a simple aquatic villain. Mark Taylor revealed that the character was based on Bernie Wrightson's Swamp Thing, immediately connecting him to one of the most sophisticated horror characters in comics. Bernie Wrightson's work on Swamp Thing had established new standards for atmospheric horror in comics, creating characters that embodied grotesque-esque elements while maintaining psychological depth. This influence gave the early Merman a monstrous quality that went beyond his aquatic nature. Wrightson's Swamp Thing was characterized by its tragic humanity trapped within a monstrous form, suggesting that Merman might have possessed similar psychological complexity. The connection to horror comics also implied that his powers and motivations would be more genuinely threatening than simple underwater schemes. The visual design influenced by Wrightson's work would have emphasized the monstrous aspects of Merman's character rather than making him simply an underwater equivalent of a human warrior. Wrightson's artistic style was known for its intricate pen and brushwork and ability to suggest supernatural menace through careful attention to disturbing details. Applied to Merman, this approach would have created a character whose very appearance suggested otherworldly horror. The early conception of Trapjaw revealed a character whose mental instability made him genuinely frightening rather than simply dangerous. In the original mini-comics, Trapjaw was described as a criminal from another dimension whose powers come from the mental instability he had when he was in his first dimension. This established him as not just a mere cyborg warrior, but as someone whose psychological damage had been amplified by technological enhancement. The characterization of Trapjaw as psychotic and cybernetic, who is quite violent in the comics and is portrayed as a mass murderer, created a villain whose threat came not from superior strength or skill, but from complete unpredictability. Unlike other villains who had clear motivations and goals, Trapjaw represented chaos incarnate, a being whose actions were driven by mental instability rather than rational planning. The original concept for Trapjaw also included more disturbing design elements. Early artwork showed him with pale green skin and maroon trunks, boots, and helmet, creating a color scheme that emphasized his corpse-like appearance. His articulated jaw was designed not just as a weapon, but as a visible sign of his damaged humanity, suggesting someone who had been so thoroughly broken he could no longer function as a complete person. The inspiration for Trapjaw came partly from the villain Jaws from the James Bond film Moonraker, but the mini-comic version emphasized the horrific aspects of this concept rather than its cinematic glamour. Where the Bond villain was a professional assassin with distinctive features, Trapjaw was portrayed as a barely controlled psychopath whose technological enhancements made his mental instability even more dangerous. One of the most intriguing aspects of early villain development was the case of Triclops, who was originally designed as a heroic warrior but wound up packaged with the evil characters. This transformation from hero to villain reflected the moral ambiguity that characterized the early universe, where the line between good and evil wasn't always clearly defined. In his mini-comic debut, The Terror of Triclops, he was introduced as a near match for He-Man in terms of strength, summoned by Skeletor when he decides he needs a warrior with strength on par with He-Man's. This positioning made him uniquely dangerous among Skeletor's minions. Not a creature or a monster, but a warrior whose abilities genuinely rivaled the hero's. His characterization as a skilled hunter and swordsman suggested someone who could defeat He-Man through superior technique rather than raw power. The visual design of early Triclops was also more menacing than his final incarnation. In the mini-comics, the character's costume is significantly different from the familiar figure version, with artwork showing him in unique dark red coloring that emphasized his threatening nature. This darker color scheme made him appear more sinister and militaristic than the later bright orange and blue version. Triclops' optical abilities in the early stories were portrayed as genuinely unsettling surveillance capabilities. His night vision and distavision, which enabled him to see over great distances, made him an ideal spy and assassin, while his ability to see through solid objects or around corners suggested someone who could never be escaped or hidden from. These abilities made him a more psychologically disturbing opponent than villains who relied on brute force. The early conception of Evil Lyn revealed a character whose evil was all the more terrible because it represented the corruption of a divine power. Originally working under the name Sultra, she was conceived as a direct counterpart to the goddess figure who would later become Tila. This positioning suggested that she possessed equivalent divine power, but had chosen to use it for destructive purposes. The mini-comics portrayed Evil Lyn as a yellow-skinned sorceress who wielded powerful magic and appeared to be the most intelligent of Skeletor's evil warriors. Her intelligence made her particularly dangerous because she could anticipate and counter the hero's strategies rather than simply reacting to them. Unlike the bumbling henchmen who surrounded Skeletor, Evil Lyn was portrayed as someone who could actually contribute to strategic planning. The early stories hinted at Evil Lyn's background in ways that made her corruption more disturbing. According to one interpretation, Evelyn was transformed into Evil Lyn via the evil magic coursing through Infinita, domain of Skeletor. This suggested that she had once been a normal person who had been deliberately corrupted by exposure to supernatural evil, making her both a victim and a perpetrator of darkness. Her relationship with power in the early stories was also more complex than later portrayals. While she was described as Skeletor's second-in-command, she was also characterized as someone who readily confesses that she hopes to seize her master's power and rule over Eternia herself one day. This ambition made her a threat not just to the heroes, but potentially to Skeletor himself, creating internal tension within the forces of evil that reflected the moral complexity of their early universe. The original concept for Too Bad revealed one of the most psychologically interesting villain concepts in the entire franchise. Initially called Schizo, he was meant to be a character that was half good and half evil, with both halves constantly battling each other. This concept would have created a villain who literally embodied moral conflict, serving as a physical representation of the eternal struggle between good and evil impulses. The rejection of this concept by Mattel Marketing, who said that both halves should be evil, represented a significant loss of psychological complexity. The half-good, half-evil version would have created a character whose internal conflict could drive genuinely interesting storylines, as audiences would never know which aspect of his personality might gain control at any given moment. The final version of Too Bad retains some psychological interest through his characterization as having two heads exhibiting a constant argumentative dynamic, continuously blaming each other for errors while vying for individual credit in their successes. However, this internal conflict was played primarily for comic relief rather than genuine psychological tension. The early concept would have made him a genuinely tragic figure whose moral struggles reflected larger themes about the nature of good and evil. Alfredo Alcala's dark fantasy artwork and Frank Frazetta's influence on the visual design. Alfredo Alcala's atmospheric artwork for the first four Masters of the Universe minicomics established a visual tone dramatically different from the brighter, more superhero-inspired cartoon that would follow. Drawing on his sophisticated fantasy art background from DC and Marvel titles like Conan and Kull the Conqueror, Alcala crafted a darker, moodier palette streaked with pulpy highlights. He portrayed Eternia as genuinely perilous. Castle Grayskull loomed like an organic fortress grown from the very bones of the earth, and his weathered, battle-hardened figures, including He-Man wielding swords, boot daggers, and other brutal weapons, underscored his role as a warrior rather than a conventional hero. Leveraging his horror and fantasy experience, Alcala suggested death and violence without explicit gore, creating what fans call a dark fantasy atmosphere that fit Glut's scripts to a T. Early He-Man's visual design was also heavily influenced by Frank Frazetta's work. Frazetta's iconic paintings of muscular, often partially or completely nude barbarians surviving in monster-filled, hostile realms shaped the character's minimal attire, primitive armaments, and savage environment. That harsh survival aesthetic extended to the original toy packaging and promotional art, where muscles, savagery, Teela's feminine beauty, and Skeletor's demonic visage vividly dramatized the franchise's mature moral divide between good and evil. Beastman's predatory sexual behavior. One of the most disturbing examples of sexual content in the early He-Man concepts involved Beastman's characterization as a sexual predator. In the original treatment for the character, Beastman was depicted as harboring explicit sexual desires towards human women. The early concept portrayed him as someone who yearns to take one or more of He-Man's tribe's females as a bride, despite being totally evil and corrupt. This predatory aspect of Beastman's character was not merely implied, but was positioned as a central part of his motivation. The early treatment suggested that his tribal conflicts with He-Man's people were driven partly by his desire to abduct and sexually possess human women. This characterization drew directly from sword and sorcery tropes, where bestial creatures frequently served as metaphors for unchecked sexual aggression. Teela's sexualized goddess design. The early concept for Teela revealed significant sexual content that was largely removed from her final design. Originally conceived as a warrior goddess, Teela's early designs emphasized her divine sexuality in ways that reflected the tradition of sexualized goddesses in fantasy art. Her original toy packaging even included the designation warrior goddess beneath her name, establishing her divine and potentially sexual nature. Mark Taylor's original vision for Teela was as a changeling who could play both sides with some magic, suggesting a character whose sexuality and divine power could be used as tools of manipulation and espionage. This concept was rejected by comic book writers who felt it was too complex, but it reveals the more sophisticated and adult-oriented character development that was originally planned. The early Teela designs also drew inspiration from Frazetta's depictions of powerful, sexualized women who used their physical appeal as weapons. In Frazetta's work, female characters were often portrayed as both an object of desire and the ultimate arbiter of fate, holding immense power, combining vulnerability with dangerous sexuality in ways that the sanitized cartoon version would never explore. The relationship between Teela and He-Man in early concepts also contained more explicit romantic and sexual tension. While later versions would hint at romance, the early treatments suggested a more mature relationship between divine warrior goddess and barbarian hero that reflected adult fantasy literature rather than children's entertainment. Skeletor's obsessive desires and sexual possession. The early concept for Skeletor included disturbing elements of sexual obsession that went far beyond simple villainy. In the original mini-comics, Skeletor becomes smitten with the goddess, a prototype for Teela, and seeks to make her his bride to help him in his conquest plans. This obsession was portrayed not as a mere political alliance, but as a desire for sexual possession and domination. The characterization of Skeletor's desire to make her his bride represented a form of supernatural sexual coercion that drew from horror and fantasy traditions where undead or demonic entities sought to corrupt and possess living women. This theme was common in the sword and sorcery genre, but was entirely inappropriate for children's entertainment. Violence and moral complexity in the original concept. The early He-Man universe operated under dramatically different moral and ethical frameworks than the sanitized version that would later appear on television. Donald F. Glutt, who wrote the original mini-comics, had extensive experience in adapting sword and sorcery material for younger audiences through his work on comics like Dagar the Invincible and Trag and the Sky Gods. However, his early He-Man stories retained much of the moral complexity and implicit violence that characterized the genre. In the original continuity, He-Man was not bound by the moral restrictions that would later define the character. The early mini-comics showed him engaging with genuine life-or-death situations where violence was not just acceptable, but necessary for survival. The character carried multiple weapons, including the boot dagger that appeared in Mark Taylor's original concept art, suggesting a warrior prepared for close-quarters combat. The moral landscape of this early universe was also far more complex than the clear-cut good versus evil dynamic of the later cartoon. Castle Grayskull itself was described as neutral to good and evil alike, suggesting a universe where power itself was morally ambiguous, and the distinction between hero and villain might depend more on circumstances than inherent nature. This moral complexity reflected the influence of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, where heroes frequently engaged in activities would be considered villainous by conventional standards.
Keep your fangs to yourself, Beastman.
The transformation to child-friendly content. The dramatic transformation of He-Man from savage barbarian to moral-teaching superhero occurred when Filmation acquired the rights to create the animated series in 1983. The studio faced significant pressure from parent groups and broadcast standards organizations to create content that would be suitable for young children while avoiding the violence and moral ambiguity that had characterized the original concept. Filmation's solution was to impose a strict code of non-violence on the character, fundamentally altered his nature. He-Man was prohibited from using his sword as an offensive weapon and could not punch or kick human opponents. The character was only allowed to destroy robotic enemies, and even then, his victories had to be achieved through cleverness and moral superiority rather than superior combat skills. This transformation represented a complete philosophical reversal from the original concept of a barbarian warrior whose strength and fighting ability were his primary attributes. The introduction of Prince Adam as He-Man's secret identity further domesticated the character by giving him royal connections and responsibilities conflicted with his wandering barbarian concept. Where the original He-Man was described as leaving his primitive tribe to seek adventure and defend Castle Grayskull, Prince Adam was bound by duties to his father's kingdom and constrained by the expectations of royal behavior. And that's how we got the diluted and kid-friendly version of He-Man that we know of today. While we appreciate both versions, we find the original dark vision of He-Man to be a fascinating glimpse into what might have been, a children's property that retained the edge and complexity of its sword and sorcery roots while still functioning as accessible entertainment for younger viewers. And yet, if we kept He-Man in that brutal vein, he'd risk becoming just another Conan clone and probably would have never captured the hearts of so many kids the way he ultimately did. Unfortunately, that's all we got for you this time, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.